Hello, everyone. I want to do some videos for the first reading of Plato's Phaedo. Um, I think I might have mentioned in the live session that I've done this work many times with students, and I've made many sets of videos, many sets of study questions, but I've never quite been satisfied. So I'm taking another shot at it. I may mix this in with previously done things or not, as the case may be. But this is a rather long work. Going to take some attention and time on your part. But it is a great work of literature. It's not just a great work of philosophy. It is a great work of literature. Plato was a kind of a poet and a dramatist, as well as being a great philosophical thinker. And so this work, the Phaedo, which is named for one of the characters, turns out to be a rather minor character actually in the conversation. This is a great dramatic work, as well as being one of your most important statements in the history of philosophy on the nature of death, and it is a great departure from what we've been doing so far. So far, we've been working within the space created by Epicurus's theory of death, and that space is that death is the absolute limit of our existence. You can sum that up in, the place where he says, "When we are, death has not come, and when death has come, we are not." So there's no overlap between our existence in any way and death, and that at death we are not, we are nothing. This work, which is a great work of literature, is in essence, though, an argument against Epicurus or against the Epicurean view. He never takes on Epicurus directly. I don't think Epicurus had written anything by the time that Plato wrote this dialogue. But you can take it as a direct attempt to refute the entire Epicurean view of death. That is one of the things that I've been saying is that to understand Epicurus, you have to put aside any notion that death is a transition. Death is not a transition for Epicurus. Death is a limit. But for Plato, it is a transition, or at least it's an argument that there must be some sort of transition, although there's no attempt to describe what that transition is like. It's an argument for the immortality of the soul. And if we're evaluating Plato's Phaedo, ultimately we're evaluating whether or not Plato makes a credible argument that we, part of us, continue after death. So there's an opening here, where we're introduced to the idea. Phaedo is retelling this conversation that he had. I don't know how many years before, to this other guy, Echecrates. I think Phaedo is traveling, and he's traveling outside of Athens to a smaller city, and we have to imagine that he is narrating the whole thing, and we find very quickly is that it's very dramatic because what he's really narrating are the last hours of Socrates himself, and that's something to keep in mind as you're reading this, is that this is essentially a philosophical discussion about the possibilities of life after death, possibility for the immortality of the soul, but it takes place on the day that one of the main character, Socrates, knows that he's going to be executed. He has been convicted of various things in this famous trial. I would say the most important of which is corrupting the youth of Athens. But he has been sentenced to death, and he's been sitting in jail for a while. But today's the day it's going to happen. And that has to be kept in mind, that he knows that he'll die at the end of this conversation, and all the rest of them do as well. And so in interpreting it, especially as a work of literature. We have to keep that in mind. But as a pure work of philosophy, as a work of argumentation for a certain philosophical thesis, what he wants to establish ultimately, what Plato seemingly wants to establish, is that there is a part of us, we human beings, that is deathless, that cannot die. And he calls that part the soul. The Greeks called it psyche, which is a very, very complex word. That's where we get the word psychology, usually translated as soul. But the idea that there's some aspect of us that survives death, some aspect of us that cannot die. And that, I think, is a quite difficult argument. But if you look through the introductory parts, and you really have to read through it to see what's going on, the first thing that he says, or the first thesis that he tries to defend, is not exactly that the soul is immortal, but rather something more specific. And that is right here at the bottom of page 3, where Socrates, they mention this fellow that they know named Evenus, where Socrates says, "Tell this to Evenus Cebes," and Cebes is another person there, and bid him be of good cheer, and say that I would have him come after me, if he be a wise man, and not tarry. That is, that he should follow me into death as quickly as possible. And the people who are speaking with him are like, well, what are you talking about? What, follow you into death as quickly as possible? Why would he want to do that? And this leads us into the first thing that Socrates defends in the opening section of the Phaedo, and that is that the philosopher welcomes death. Socrates says here at the top of page 4, "Why," said Socrates, "is not Evenus a philosopher?" "I think that he is," said Simmias. "Then he, or any man who has the spirit of philosophy, will be willing to die, but he will not take his own life, for that is held to be unlawful." And so Socrates says basically philosophers should be willing to die. They should welcome death. They shouldn't kill themselves, because he considers that to be unethical, but that they should look forward to death. And in fact, he characterizes philosophy itself as a kind of a practicing for death. And the first part of the dialogue, again, I think really is Socrates explaining why he would say such a thing, that the philosopher is somebody who should actually welcome death, and that philosophy itself is a preparation for death. Why would anybody say such a thing?